The capture of Buenos Aires provoked many reactions among its population. The inhabitants, moved by their interest, end up divided into groups. Some saw the British presence at the city as a positive outcome. The smugglers had made fortune by passing the Spanish monopoly, but the British open commerce policy was an opportunity to make their operations legal. On the other side were those who loathed the British and wanted to expel them as soon as possible. These people were the commoners, who were rabidly loyal to King Charles IV, and the merchants, who depended on the Spanish monopoly to make their money. Others who welcomed the British were those who were after more autonomy or even independence from the Spanish crown. They saw the British as the easiest and safest path to achieve their goals. Another group who seek to expel the invader were those who wanted total independence from any European power, be it Spain or the United Kingdom. Although things looked calm on the surface and the British felt master of the situation, the resistance had started from the very first day. The first two men to put things in movement were two young Catalans, Felipe de Centenach and Gerardo Esteve i Lach. Through their observation and friendly chats with British officers, the Spaniards were able to determine that the invaders' force were extremely weak. At the same time, on June 25, Captain Santiago de Liniers decided to launch his own plan. On June 29, he arrived at Buenos Aires, and in order to enter the city, he swore that he was not going to fight against the British and that he would abandon his military career. For a couple of days, Liniers fraternized with the invader, while he secretly met with the members of the Cabildo and the church. The priest could not stand the presence of Protestants and were more than willing to help in their expulsion. By July 3rd, Centenach and Lach had finished a report for the government of Montevideo, Pascual Ruiz Huidobro, where they informed him of everything that had happened and the detail of the occupation. They trust that with only 1,000 men, 12 cannon and some ships, the city could be retaken. On July 10, Liniers left the city inbound for the town of Las Conchas, from where he traveled to Colonia and from there to Montevideo, where he expected to get support from the governor. A few days later, Juan Martín de Pueyrredón followed the same path. At first, he believed that the occupation would be good for his goals of achieving independence, but soon felt that the British were there to impose just another colonial government. Meanwhile, at Buenos Aires, Martín de Álzaga, a merchant who thrived under the Spanish monopoly and was the richest man in the city, started to use his own spy network and economic power to support Centenach and Lach's resistance movement. This influx of money allowed the expansion of their operation. 500 men were to be recruited and trained at a fortified estancia in the city's outskirts. Weapons and ammunition were to be stored in houses around the city, and 2 mines were to be dug under the fort and the Rancheria barracks. Once the mines were completed, gunpowder was to be stashed in them, and then they will be blown up as soon as the assault from Montevideo started. By July 15, 1,900 men had been recruited. They pledged their loyalty to Charles IV, chose the Virgen de la Concepción as their saint patron, and were paid 4 reales per day. Álzaga trusted that his support for the insurgency would, later, help him advance his political career. During the next 2 weeks, another 2,000 men joined without pay as a reserve. By July 16, the estancia that would work as a training ground was already rented. At the same time, Montevideo burst with activity. When on July 1st, the people learned that Buenos Aires had fallen, a public meeting was called at the St. Francis cloister. The people decided that they were going to help liberating the capital city. The arrival of Popan's ships and the blockade they imposed on the 3rd only fueled the popular desire to engage in combat. Governor Huidobro spent many days collecting donations from the citizens of Montevideo, who gave up jewelry, ships and money to fund the expedition. By July 4th, 3 new militias were created. Voluntary troops from France, Navarre and Biscay, under the command of Lieutenant Agustin Abreu Horta. Voluntary troops from Galicia and Asturias, commanded by Captain Roque Riobo. a unit of Miñones with 70 regular retired soldiers commanded by Lieutenant Rafael Bofarul and José Grau. And finally, the irregular cavalry, a group of mounted men who provide their own horses and were paid 12 pesos monthly. By July 10 and 11, a naval squadron was formed, with 6 gunships, 8 transport, and 6 armed ships commanded by Juan Gutiérrez de la Concha. The next day, a letter from the Viceroy arrived from Córdoba. He informed that that city would act as a temporary capital and that he was gathering troops for a counterattack. The citizens of Montevideo were not impressed by his declarations. On July 14, Pueyrredón arrived at Montevideo, and the next day he was sent to Luján to command the troops that were gathering there. On the other side of the river, the Catalans' plan had been progressing. By July 17, all the troops had gathered at the estancia at Pedriel, and a house was rented from where to start the mine that was going to blow up the Rancherias Barrac. That same day, Governor Huidobro approved Centenach and Lach plans and informed them that reinforcements were on their way. After 2 weeks, the impending insurrection was talked about all over the city. Beresford had received intelligence, albeit a bit vague, about the expedition being formed at Montevideo and the encampment of troops outside Buenos Aires. Beresford also learned about the existence of a gunpowder depot in the town of Flores, and he sent soldiers to capture it. The British tried to save as much gunpowder as possible, but during the loading an explosion occurred, which killed 2 and left many more wounded. This showed clearly to Beresford that the insurrection was being supported by the Spanish civil servants, who had assured him that there were no weapons being stored and had remained silent about this gunpowder depot. Another issue that worried Beresford was the high level of desertion among his troops, especially among Catholic soldiers who were being tempted with promises of marriage, land and money. On July 19, Beresford publicly announced that anyone helping a deserter would be executed. To make things worse, a huge number of Spanish prisoners went missing. Of the 500 soldiers who had pledged not to fight against the British, only 12 reported to the fort as demanded inter-surrender agreement. The rest had joined the resistance. By July 22, the Catalans have received the green light from Huidobro. This made them double their efforts. A house on the San Juan street was rented to be used as a gun shop. 5 men worked day and night making cartridges. On July 24, the digging of the first mine started, and by the 26th, another house was rented to start the mine that would be dug under the fort. That same day, Pueyrredón arrived at Luján, where he met 1,000 mounted soldiers. Among them were 200 Blandengues who had fought at Quilmes. On July 28, they marched towards Pedriel. By July 28, the mines were finished. At the end of the tunnel, there were 2 chambers where 36 barrels of gunpowder were placed, ready to be blown up. By the end of July, the British started to feel vulnerable. Beresford remained calm because he was sure that the expedition from Montevideo was not going to be able to bypass the British blockade. On July 28, Beresford learned that Liniers had arrived at Colonia and he sent the encounter. At Buenos Aires, he paraded his whole army at the main square to show the city that they were ready to fight. The encounter arrived at Colonia at midday of July 30. There they saw a great number of Spanish ships, which they attacked an hour later. The Spanish fleet had 10 gunships and some small boats, all heavily armed. The response was strong, and Captain Talbot, from the encounter, had to retreat under fire. When Talbot arrived at Buenos Aires, he found the troops getting ready for combat. Beresford had discovered that same day that Pueyrredón planned to rendezvous with Buenos Aires voluntaries at Pedriel. There, the British commander planned to squash the rebel army.